So this is episode 2 of Brandon's book club, specifically for Tress of the Emerald Sea. In our first episode, we talked about parts 1 through 3. In this episode, we're going to be talking about part 4. Again, this will be spoiler-free for the wider Cosmere, but after we finish our discussion on each of the parts, we will have a spoiler video as well, digging deeper into it. So part 4 was a lot of building the world and the magic and everything that Sanderson is about to go crazy with. So specifically, we spent some time talking about the moons. And Ammon, I know that that's something that you're very interested in.
Yes, so I love the aspect of the moons being around the planet. So we know that the planet is probably in some sort of solar system like ours and is rotating around the sun. But the way that the moons are, they're in what's called geosynchronous orbit. So they stay with the planet as it rotates. Our moon is tidally locked, so it'll rotate around us, but we only see one side. These moons seem to be just geosynchronous, and they don't move around the planet at all. You can only see them from a specific point.
Yes.
And I love how he brings that into the storytelling. There's what's called moonfall in this, where the sun goes behind the moon as opposed to going underneath the horizon.
Yeah.
It reminded me a lot of the Avatar, the Pandora. They have a big planet there that the sun goes behind the planet and creates kind of a second nighttime. And one thing that I wish that he had done was distinguish the difference between the two. He talked about the sun going behind the moon as nighttime and then called it moonfall as well. So it's interesting to see how that also affects the day-night cycle on this planet. And to have those 12 moons around this planet really creates an interesting way that you would need to sail, because you can't always sail during the nighttime, especially in some more dangerous seas.
How does having 12 moons and having them so close, how does that affect the tides? This is what I need to know.
So there's got to be some other magic there. Having them so close would, they fill up a large portion of the sky, would actually affect us walking around on the planet as well. If the gravitational pull is so strong, we would feel, as we go underneath a moon that is bigger, you would feel lighter. So there's got to be some sort of magic that is not influencing the gravitation on this planet as much. So I would doubt that tides would have a major impact on the spore sea, especially since it's not an actual fluid that moves around. It is just spores being... what is the word?
It's like a fluidization.
Fluidization.
Yeah, churned.
Yeah. Being churned and fluidized, so it's not going to affect the levels as much. Because it's not one liquid that can be pulled all together.
Yeah. Interesting. We built on a lot of different things. I know there were some that you were really interested in as well, as far as like the world and...
Well, the ether, I think, was just most interesting to me because we have seen that briefly in other Cosmere novels. And it is presented very differently here. And Hoyt even mentions that. He says it's very volatile here. It's, you know, it's not like this symbiotic relationship. So I do think it's interesting that our biggest introduction to this magic is an abnormal form of it. So that to me was very interesting. Like, people fear it here. People don't really work with it. What is interesting that, especially in this section, we see Tress work with it, which is something that I think was surprising for me as a reader because we've only seen it so far as this destructive force. And so I thought that was a very interesting way to introduce us to the magic system, and also this idea that, well, we don't really know how it is in its pure form. So that's kind of a weird Cosmere thing.
It is weird. And the way that Tress starts to learn to control it, too, is always really interesting to me. Like the way that she experiments with it and kind of, you know, plays with it to be able to figure out how to work with the spores and with their different manifestations was really fascinating, and a lot of her character too. Her very curious, very stick in the mud. What did you call her?
Down to earth, stick in the mud. Yeah.
But the way that she's just very logical. She just stops and thinks and kind of plays with it, and other people would just shy away and fear it, and Tress kind of leans in because it fascinates her. So that's more important than anything else.
Yeah, and I love that. I geeked out over her learning all about the spores in this section. I was like, this is what I would do. I just wanted these highly dangerous things in my hands at all times. I'd die young. But yeah, and something I think is interesting is kind of like the emphasis of like the beauty of the spores and also the danger. Like I feel like that in this section of the book in particular, that's like emphasized because I just love the visuals in this book. Like it's just so beautiful, and like with the moon so close and like the spores coming down and just all this. So I really love that we get to see Tress like kind of embrace that kind of like dichotomy. Is that what I'm thinking? Yeah, like dichotomy of like beauty and terror kind of like mixed into one that kind of like blurs the more she like works with the spores. And it also just makes your imagination kind of go crazy because there's 12 moons and we only see like 4 spores, like maybe 5. I didn't keep count. I think there's only like 5 or I think there's about 5
They talked about them being like, there being like 12 total or maybe 13.
12 and a 13th mysterious
13
bone.
mysterious one.
And I'm like, and that just like, it just makes me think like, I wonder what the other spores are. And like, I'm like, I kind of wish he would write another book set on this world, and maybe he will.
Yeah. And why are there rumors of a 13th? And why was that so quickly shot down?
And why is that like a legend or whatever? Yeah. So this is really interesting. Like I love when a magic system makes you start imagining things about it and like makes you like engage mentally with it. And I feel like that in this section of the book that came out a lot, and I really liked it.
Yeah, the only thing I wish we had was an image. Like the illustrations are so gorgeous, and that's one thing I wish we had gotten an illustration of is the planet with the moon somehow. Like I realized we probably couldn't see them all at once, but I need personal help with that visualization. Like it's very hard for me, and even how the seas meet, 12 of them across the planet, it's hard for me to visualize.
Yeah, a map would be cool.
A map would be very cool.
Yes.
Yeah, especially because as they're sailing from one sea, like from the Crimson to just specifically from the Verdant to the Crimson, it's like it's a whole scenery change. It's a color change. It's everything changes. So like I'm wondering, okay, so do the moons have this almost like atmospheric bubble, and as you cross into another one, it's almost like you're leaving this bubble and going into another? Is it like a line? Like we kind of got that illustration where it showed the two. It was a 2-page spread. This one where it showed
like the green going into
both, and I'm like, okay, so is it a line? Is it like I want to know how that physically would look crossing from one sea to the other. And then 2, also, okay, so the moon spores, they land in their own domain, but then what happens if the spores cross over a little bit? Because they've got to be touching. So what if water touches both, and then do they just explode in their own way? Can they converge? I have so many questions.
The way that I thought of it was I've seen pictures of like what it looks like to swim along like a tectonic plate. And it's really beautiful because there's this delineation. And you can really see like on both sides, like the color change. And sure, there's got to be some exchange, but there's like this other factor besides just like this liquid and this liquid are mixing. There's like this other factor that like maybe we don't see. Maybe that's like the mountains beyond mountains that only the author knows, that we have to kind of imagine, but that also prove that this world is like bigger, like, and more well thought out than we can perceive as the reader.
You just saying that gave me a thought, which is we argued about, well, not argued, but we discussed like the different, like our different perceptions of spores. There might be like a density change between different kinds of spores or some sort of size. We don't know technically that they're all.
And we know that they look different from one another.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking is the 2 spores, they look different. They're probably shaped different, and so when they're next to each other, they're not going to mix in very well with each other because they're shaped differently. It's like a round peg in a square hole.
Interesting. So now I want to see her play with that. I want to see her mess with 2 spores at the same time and see what happens. And see how they like, would they explode harder if they're next to each other, or like do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
kind of like going back to what you said about her like starting to work with the spores, like that was probably the most personal part of the book for me because I'm a forager. I mean, it's the second part of my username. And like all foragers that I know, like we work with nature and we try to work with like what exists already to make sure that we are like not just like being able to like do things safely, but also like being sustainable so that things can proceed as they should. And in order to do that, you really have to get to know like the individual organism. Like when I like read about her, kind of almost being a little confused at why people are amazed at how she's not afraid of spores. Like I have felt that way because I eat wild mushrooms and people look at me like I'm insane. But so much of it has to do with like
the other half of your username. So
yeah, it has to do with like, you have to respect what's in front of you. And I feel like she does that so beautifully by not just immediately being terrified, but being willing to engage, being willing to like enter into a dialogue. And I think that that is like beautiful and so important for this like curious scientific type of character that she is.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we actually do get to see her really messing with them in this section. What rose spores, what were they called?
Rosite?
The rosite.
The rosite, thanks. Which that was one of my favorite scenes, actually seeing her having to figure out the tools real fast. That's another really high tension scene where, you know, they have the hole in their ship and then she and Anne have to go down and sort it out because Anne's the carpenter and now she's the new so seeing her working with the tools, which that's also I know an interest. You can go ahead.
Well, it's just, you know, if you've read Mistborn, you will recognize how the tools work and you could have predicted how those tools were going to work. So it's another example of how the wider book series, their magic systems coexist together. And one of my favorite parts about that is Hoyd specifically calls a fourth wall break and is like, I will tell you this one pushes, this one pulls for those people keeping track. And I'm like, thank you. I do feel called out. I am keeping track. But yeah, so, you know, they had the steel, you know, pulling and pushing and the aluminum protects things and silver. If you've read some of the novellas, you'll know that silver works in the same way here. And so that's just an added layer. If you're a first-time Tress reader, you're just discovering the magic system. And as you continue down Brandon's other books, this will be the spot where you're like, oh, hey, it works just like Tress. Yeah, and so I do like to see those connections. And it was very cool to see that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of authors, when they do these multi-tiered series or multi-tiered writing experiments like Sanderson does, a lot of times they'll keep their magic systems consistent and just build, kind of like Mistborn Era 1 and Era 2. But something really impressive that he does is he creates completely unique magic systems, but still intertwines them, still makes them make sense together so that it does feel like a cohesive world, which is something that while I've seen this Cosmere thing, I've seen it done, I've never seen it done to the intricacy that he does it. It's really impressive.
Agreed, because you know, when you read Tress, it felt so new. I think we all kind of talked about that last time, like, wow, this feels so inventive. But yet, it's still, I can clearly see how it connects to everything else, and that's unique.
One theme that keeps popping up is that tools are only as good as the person who's wielding them.
Yeah.
And I think that like it just plays out really beautifully in part 4 when you really start to see tools in different people's hands and how they are manipulating them, and particularly Tress and how Tress approaches the use of these tools that are sometimes extremely dangerous in really innovative ways.
Yeah, yeah, and unlocking more information about like how they were used previous and really having that fascination and playing with them and experimenting with them. It has that analytical side of her. But as well, this is where she also finds out that the cannonballs have been swapped and she figures out how to stop them from taking down the next ship, which is so funny because I was with Tress when she was like, wait, that was really dumb. They're going to know that was me. And I'm like, yeah, that was really dumb. They're going to know that was you, you know? But Captain Crow, we also get a big reveal with her, with everything going on inside of her. Yeah.
it satisfied my horror side of things. Yeah, it was a great moment when Crow shot herself in the face. She should do it more often. But yeah, I thought that was another like really interesting like addition to like the magic system overall, because we didn't know like some people actually have spores inside of them that don't kill them, and you know, just that whole like,
Well, it is killing her.
yeah, but not immediately.
Right.
Yeah, because I feel like in the first 3 sections of the book, it's very much like clear that like if you inhale a spore,
Yeah.
you were
will
dead.
die.
Yeah,
Exactly.
immediately dead. And then we see that Crow is like the exception to that, and then
Right.
like just kind of digging into like there are multiple people who are exceptions, and I mean maybe there's people who have like the crimson spores in them and like things like that, and just
Yeah.
another like moment where I felt like I was like, it's like spiraling, you know. I'm like, I know this isn't like relevant to the actual story right now, but now I'm thinking about it.
Oh yeah, it's
Yeah.
like it is a standalone, but we could easily explore more seas and explore more of that aspect
Yeah.
of it and everything.
It's just, it makes it feel so broad, because kind of what we were talking about
Yeah.
with the world feels very fleshed out, even though we
it
are.
does. It feels bigger than
Yeah.
the story.
Yeah, even though like I feel like this book more than some of Brandon's other books are very like is very narrow, because it's very focused on Tress.
Yeah.
But it still manages to feel very broad in the sense that like, yeah, this world does have like tons of other stories that could be told and maybe will be told. I hope they're told someday.
Yeah. And I know, Bookborn, you were specifically very interested in everything around Crow and what was going on inside of her and all the implications.
Well, it's just interesting because we're seeing bonds in this book that are very different than bonds we see in other books. Bonds in other books tend to be cognitive in nature without going too much into that. And this one is a physical in nature. She has to keep drinking or else it will deplete, right? It's depleting a physical resource.
Right.
And as Tress starts experimenting with that, we see her physical resources start to be depleted. And it's interesting to me, it feels scarier to have the physical bond than this cognitive bond, which is kind of weird. Like,
No, I agree.
I don't know why it feels that way. Did everyone else feel like it felt scarier?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it affects her in a much more physical way. And I think also just like the fact that you know that she's going to die and we don't know, like it could be tomorrow, it could be in a couple of months. And there's a level of fear that comes with that.
It's sinister. There's like a sinister
Yeah.
underline when Tress is using them, when this with Crow. It doesn't feel as happy or maybe as reciprocal, even though it is, it feels like more,
Yeah, like Tress has figured something out that Crow hasn't, and that is that you can like work with,
Right.
instead of just like appeasing. You know, there's this exchange, you know, water in exchange for you operating the way that I'm asking you to.
Yeah.
And Crow has this super forceful personality, and she's really scary.
Oh, yeah. Very cutthroat.
Very cutthroat. And so like it makes sense that her relationship to the spores would also be this like fight to the death.
So do you think it would manifest differently in someone else? Do you think that that's part of the personality of what's inhibiting her and the personality of herself?
It's hard to say, but it does seem telling that her relationship with the spores is so similar to her relationship with everybody else.
Yeah, that is interesting.
point.
I'm going to have to play with that in my head. Like,
Yeah.
oh, what will it look like in someone else?
And I think it lends an air of not only mystery, like how did she get that? It also is like that, could this happen to Tress? She's experimenting with these spores. She's around them a lot. Is this something that we're going to have to see her deal with? And not knowing how Crow got it, we kind of, at least for me, I don't know about you guys, I feared that Tress may have picked something up while she was walking across the spores.
Sure. Well, we do see enough of growth in her that we could easily attribute that to something else. We could easily say that something else is influencing her that's causing her to kind of, you know, be more bold and less afraid of asking things from other people and stuff like that.
I think it goes back to what Lynn said about how the world feels fuller. There's all these answers, these questions that we don't get. How would that manifest if it was a different spore? I don't know. It's kind of easier to imagine the vines than maybe something from the Crimson or Mint. Like I can't even really imagine how that would be. And so it leaves these questions that are...
I'm imagining the crimson spores turning somebody into like a literal ticking time bomb.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We also get to see Tress experiment with the midnight spores in this section.
Yes.
Which, I loved it so much. I love that it manifested as a rat.
Yes, of course.
Like,
yeah, it's
so
like, of
sweet.
course.
But yeah, seeing her experiment with it, and again, it goes back to Tress is afraid of the spores, but she's more interested than she is afraid. The more she gets to know them, the more she gets to understand how they work. And so because of that, she's able to utilize them where others would have completely rejected. And through that, she's able to learn about Crow's motivation, what she's trying to do, and learn more about, well, we learn about Zysis. Is that going to be the consensus how we pronounce it?
Yeah.
Tell us in the comment section that we're wrong. Zysis, which is, we've seen dragons, or we've heard mention of dragons before, but this is like, we're going to go meet a dragon, maybe? That excited me.
This was the moment. We keep getting teased. We've been teased a lot in the Cosmere, and this was like, oh, we're going to actually get to do it. You're not going to dangle
So
it.
as a dragon lover, and then as Tress is going around being like, okay, I'll convince Crow to do this thing that I know she already wants to do. And then she talks to Crow, and then she's like, okay, I'll convince the crew to do this thing that they've already said they want to do. Like she's kind of playing that game. And I'm like, yeah, do it. Let's go see the dragon. How's this going to look? And sure, you're going to have to live in eternal servitude to it, but let's go see the dragon.
I feel like so much of part 4 is Crow's way versus Tress's way of doing things. And the big difference there, when I really boil it down, is that Tress respects others and Crow does not. Like the way that Crow manipulates the crew into like becoming dead runners, and all of this, like all the things that she does to make them fear her. Even the way, like going back to like the spores, like the way that they both interact with the spores, like there's a distinct lack of respect on Crow's part, whereas with Tress, she partly like is kind of like beloved by everybody because of how respectful she is.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that really shows a lot with how Tress and Crow are navigating the crew as well. You brought it up, Crow wanting everyone, she's going to manipulate them into ruining their lives and ruining their futures, and she knows, like the crew knows each other, so she knows that Soleil has a greater goal. That's later. So, but we'll talk about it later. But she knows that Soleil has a greater goal and a good one, like one that's really valuable to her. And she's ready to cut those ties for her. Whereas Tress has a way out and can like leave, and she's manipulated the captain into letting her leave, and she chooses to come back on the ship because she cares about the individuals. And that ultimately is what causes her to develop these bonds with these individuals.
I think it's playing on the hero trope again. The idea of the hero that we see might be like a Crow, someone very forceful and is taking command and is going to do those. And we see that Tress's superpower is kindness, which as silly as that sounds, it's understanding people. And to your guys' points, it's how they deal with their fear. Someone deals with their fear by pushing it down and steamrolling others, and Tress deals with fear by acceptance of what it is, accepting the spores or the people. And I think that's a wider theme as well.
Yeah, and we do also have Tress learning to lie, which is like, that's kind of the side of herself that she's not thrilled that she's had to accept. Like whenever, what was it that Soleil was sure that she would, the Knight's
King's Mask. King's
Mask, an assassin. And she's like, it would behoove me to let you believe this. But that's also a little bit manipulative. And she ends up doing it. And I appreciate seeing like the negative, because Tress is such a noble, kind, good character, like truly good. And it's nice to see her not always making choices like that.
Yeah, though she does try to not lie about being a King's Mask. Like that was
try very hard.
Yeah. But I like it was funny to me, that whole like situation is like she doesn't feel very good about it. She's not really into it, but like anything she says, they will take as confirmation. Like that whole like dynamic was interesting to me because it kind of spoke to the crew's desperation. Like they're so desperate that they're willing to believe something that is just clearly not true. I guess it's just interesting to me how what people are willing to buy out of desperation.
Right.
Like I know there's been stories that I've interacted with that people have critiqued being like, oh, I couldn't buy this because like, how would this character even believe that? I'm like, well, how desperate were they? You know, I'm like, how desperate were they to believe this? I thought that was really well done. And just like Tress's interaction with the crew. And how she's 18, you know, I'm like, why would you think this 18-year-old girl could save you? It's because they don't think they can save themselves, and she's the only one that feels like she has some kind of control.
And if she is the king's mask, she's taking an aging potion to make herself
Oh,
look
of
younger.
course, yeah.
So like they can also manufacture their own answers.
Yeah.
Which
that still feels like desperate to me. You know, I'm like, you're
when
still
I
pulling
You
at
must have
straws.
something to say about this because you see people believe things that are unbelievable all the time.
Yes.
Such a good point.
It comes, like they were saying, out of desperation, but it comes from the territory of being a pirate. I mean, you see it in people that believe in the flat earth. It comes from the territory of not wanting to trust government entities. And so they're pirates, and they live on the side of the law even when they weren't pirates, when they were still doing cargo. They have to live on this edge of law, and they have to be, what is the word?
not taking
Suspicious.
it so, yeah,
Suspicious of everything.
Yeah.
This girl that comes across the spore ocean, that knows how to use spores, she can hang on to the ship, and so it comes out of that. They want to find something in everything.
Yeah.
And so that's common with these conspiracies, is they're looking for something when there is nothing.
I think historically pirates for a long period of time, it looked a lot like this, where, you know, a pirate ship would find a cargo ship and then say, okay, where's your carpenter or where's your whatever they need, seize that person, force them to become a pirate, and then the government would say, you're a pirate, you'll be hanged. And regardless, and the person can say, it was under duress, I didn't want this. It doesn't matter. The government viewed pirates, or, you know, the royalty viewed pirates as pirates, and their life was over without them ever actually choosing this life. And I feel like Sanderson kind of played with that with Crow, where she was like, I don't care. You're pirates now, and you're this kind of pirate now, and the world will view you that way regardless. Which, knowing these people, knowing that they don't want to actually do this stuff, you know, it's so sad.
Yeah.
It's incredibly selfish.
Yeah. Yeah. So we do end up talking to Hoyd, and through this very roundabout, ridiculous, hilarious way, learn that Tress's goal is now to break Hoyd's curse. But she has to figure out what the curse looks like and how to break it by asking him questions that he can't answer. So it's like this roundabout thing. And that was one of my favorite elements of this section, is just, you know, that silliness, that lightheartedness that Sanderson injects into everything. How did you feel about her mission in that?
Yeah, well, it's funny because it does add to a rereadability.
Yeah.
Because Hoyd has been dropping these hints that we might not have realized this entire time. And I mean, for the most part, you kind of understand them as you keep going. But I do love that when you're like, oh, I can go back and point to him saying this and this and this, and oh, I get it now. So I always love that part of it. But yeah, I mean, Hoyd's been acting ridiculous. And so to hear a little bit more about the curse, I think, was really gratifying in this part. Yeah.
And he's so defensive too, where he's like, listen, even the most intelligent people mess up sometimes.
Yeah, and watching, I mean, again, it's more about Tress too, and her willingness to discover it. I mean, that's like, I think you guys talked really good about the themes of that, you know? It's all part of that, I think.
And she ends up getting the clue from him about the stars. Do you remember that? And Huck,
spores.
yeah, and Huck helps her. Yeah, that's how she finds the midnight spores, which we've already talked about. That was another piece where I was like, she learned about the stars from Hoyd and then went into her bedroom and then found the stars. And I was like, that was fast. It was one of those things where I kind of had to like pause for a second. But then we also learn about Huck, and that we're looking for a familiar. Well, where did you guys land with all that? Because that was a big moment for me, where I was like, oh, the familiar is going to be connected to the sorceress, huh? And that's when I started piecing things together, which we'll talk about later. But I mean, did any of y'all kind of like have a reaction to that?
I think my reaction still was like, this still doesn't feel very Cosmere, like sorceresses with a familiar. I was still on the fence at that.
You were?
Yeah.
Did you ever get sold on it?
I don't think I did.
Really? You're still just not a huge fan of the whole execution,
and
the whole concept?
But I think it's more like maybe just how it was phrased. Like the term familiar. I'm like, this is Earth. You know, I'm like immediately, I'm like, this is this is Earth. This is like our fairy tales very much. So it's like, it's funny because one of my favorite things about the book is the fairy tale-esqueness of it. And yet at times that's what actually took away from the story for me.
Interesting.
So yeah, I whenever Huck was called like a familiar or something, I was like,
It was Hoyd, though, that called him that, right?
Yeah.
Or was it Ulan?
It was Hoyt.
It was
Hoyd.
Hoyd?
Ulam says it later, but Hoyd is the first one that brings it up.
Yeah, so I feel like that kind of explains why he would use a term that we would be familiar with. Like,
Maybe.
let me patch that hole real quick. So let's say that Hoyd is telling this story, and so he's using language familiar to the audience that would have heard the story.
maybe.
It's okay, you don't have to like it.
That's how I like to look at it, is that the story is happening in a completely different language, the language that is
That's
native
true.
to whatever person he's telling it to.
That's a good
and
point.
it's being translated to us, and their word for whatever a talking animal that is a companion to a magical being would be, to us that's called a familiar.
Yeah.
And so that's a word that we're familiar with. Instead of calling it a dinglehopper, we know that it's a familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this was definitely the part, like you, I started putting things together. I don't think I had it completely yet, but it was clearly a big clue. I mean, that was when we started realizing everything Hoyd's been saying is pointed. In some way.
Exactly. Yeah, that he's really trying hard to help Tress solve this. I feel like you were like on the edge of your seat to say something a second ago.
I was waiting for familiar to mean something else.
Oh, okay.
Like, because this is Cosmere. And I was like, he's not going to just use like random magical terms that we've all agreed on. But I also think that we have to think about, like, again, who Hoyd's audience is and about how Tress of the Emerald Sea is a really good entry point into the rest of the Cosmere.
Yeah.
So it kind of feels like, you know, this is the outside door being opened up, and maybe he's talking to people from our world to pull them in so that they can later understand the rest of what's going on in this completely different universe.
Yeah.
And that scene for me where Hoyd is talking about the talking animal, that's where it started to click for me, and I started to accept Huck as a talking rat. It made sense to me now. There is a reason for it, as opposed to it's just this random thing that mice just talk.
Yeah.
But now there is at least a magical reason why he might be talking. So I accepted it a little bit more than just a natural mouse that are on all of the islands.
Excuse you, sir. He is a rat.
I apologize. There is a difference. I don't know what it is.
I know it's not cool of me, but every time he would write Huck climbing on Tress's shoulder, I was just picturing that rat tail hanging down, and like I was like, no, I know Tress is nice, and I know that he's nice, but there's still a rat on her shoulder.
It's very piratey, though. You know, you got the little
is very
shoulder animal.
piratey.
Yep.
That's fair enough, I guess.
I actually did kind of wonder if Huck might be kind of a stand-in for like the parrot trope.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So I feel like I really want to talk more about the Midnight Spores and how she handled that, and how she was able to spy, and then that it didn't leave a trace, because when she spoke with Ulam, and Ulam, and Ulam was like, oh, it'd be a puff of smoke, it'll disappear. I was like, no, she knows. You know, like I was like, no way did we get off that easy. You know what I mean? Did y'all have any theories about where this all was going to take us? Because I felt like I had no idea about what Sanderson was going to do with all this.
I definitely thought that there was no way that Crow didn't know. I mean, she is a spore eater, so she has this parasitic relationship with the spores, and I feel like she would have been able to tell. Even if there was no residue left over, the spores may have been able to, I don't know, signal to her, talk to her through the Lul bond?
Yeah.
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 The Luhol?
Luhol. Something, yeah.
It's Nahil, right? So
Luhol. The
and then the other one's
bond.
Nahil?
Yeah.
The bond.
Talk to her through the bond. So I feel like even though they're separate spores, there is still this connection between them because they're all aethers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I just thought the same. Like, she probably has access to midnight spores. Like this idea that Tress is ahead of everybody, you just never get the sense that she'll ever actually be a step ahead.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, around every corner, people are saying, "Wait, you actually don't know about this?"
Yeah.
And around every corner, she's like, "I was not prepared. Why did I think that I could do this?"
Yeah. She's like, I figured it out. And everyone's like, yeah.
No.
Okay, that's how it works.
But it's also good foreshadowing for we know that the sorceress is in the Midnight Sea. And so then seeing how the midnight spores worked, it was also getting me to be like, okay, well, what is that going to mean when they're in there? And I wasn't sure actually how it was going to manifest as an entire sea. I don't know if anyone else felt like they knew.
No.
But-
Best bet that I had was I was still thinking in terms of like equivalent exchange. Like you give the spores something, they give something back to you, and they're dangerous, but there is that like mutual respect between the person wielding the spores and the spores themselves. And so the best guess that I had was there is an exchange required with midnight spores, but that it is a higher price than the others. And I didn't know what that meant.
Okay, so favorites and least favorite scenes for everybody bookborn.
My favorite scenes were definitely her experimentation.
Yeah.
Like I'm sure a lot of people are going to say that, but everything from when she had to quickly do it with Anne to you know, the midnight spore scene, like that was all my favorite part, just learning about that. As far as least favorite parts, there is a story that Hoyd tells in this section called the Tosher. Is that what it's called? Nope. That is just absolutely...
Just because he's stinky or what? What makes you not like it?
Poop story. It's just not my humor. I could not believe what I was reading. Like I could because it was Hoyd, but also just the opposite of my humor.
Yeah.
So I was just very grateful, like when that story was done. So definitely not my favorite part.
I feel like it wasn't even that essential to the book.
It
Like it was
absolutely
the
was.
point. Tell me. Explain yourself.
Well, small actions can lead to bigger things. That's
But it
the
had
whole...
to be that story.
It had to be.
Yeah.
It had to be poop. It had to be.
I feel like that story illustrates that strongly. Like I think Sanderson just
Brandon
wanted
thought
to
it
write
was
poop
funny.
story.
Brandon thought it was funny.
Yeah.
That's his humor.
And that's the thing. Sanderson leans into his humor in this.
Absolutely.
And you can see it a lot where it's like, oh, Sanderson just wanted to tell that joke.
And it usually works, but this was one where I was like, okay, we differ. We're not going to see eye to eye about this little story.
Yeah,
So
that's fair. I do wonder though, before we continue on with what I just said we were doing, how did the humor land? Because my dad is a massive Sanderson fan, and he told me, he was like, the humor in this book grated on me, and I was like, oh, it was like my favorite part of the book. It was so funny.
it's interesting because a lot of Sanderson's humor doesn't actually work for me. It's how you mentioned the prose, like that's fine for me. It's a lot of times the humor, it's just not necessarily my humor. So surprisingly, most of the humor in the book was something I did like because it felt more cheeky than outright humor. You know, when he's saying at the beginning, like, oh, Tress had a way with words and that words got away from her. Like, that's my kind of like lighthearted humor.
Yeah.
So that worked for me, but yeah, no poop in general for me as a humor.
Your favorite and least favorite, yeah.
They overtook the second ship in this part, right? That was third. Okay, so I loved that sequence, especially when Anne pulled out her pistol and everyone just immediately started taking it away from her, and then she's like, fine, and pulls out another one. I love that she has 3 of them because she knows that she's going to get 2 of them taken away trying to shoot. And she's like, Captain, please let me shoot at least one person before I go and fix the hole.
Is that a trope you like when someone gets to keep pulling weapons from different spots?
I love that so much. They're just going, they're like pulling it out. It works every single time. I will never not laugh at that. And I also loved her experimenting with the cannonballs. I love the physics behind how getting the magic system to work in a physical way, especially with the cannonballs, because they have like 3 different spores inside of it. They have the rosite, the verdant, and the one that explodes.
The crimson.
The crimson in there. Yeah, it has all 3 of them together working, and I love seeing that happen. And I love the poop story.
Okay.
Did you say what your least favorite part was?
I don't know. So I feel like I had a qualm with the way that she comes back from using the midnight spores. She comes back as like super deflated and everything, and then she drinks water and she's fine. I feel like that should have lasting effects, because like the draining was magical, but I feel like the replacement is not. So I feel like she should have had
That's a good point.
sunken eyes for a few days until she could get back to her full health.
That could also put her on edge, because then she's concerned that people are going to notice her physical
Exactly. Yep.
difference. That's a good point. Crazy Forager.
My favorite part was probably like just watching her figure out what everybody else on the ship is really about. That everybody has a quirk, and I like seeing the quirks, and definitely just, it's not a part. I get really into like meta narrative. So like my favorite part of the fourth part is really just seeing her interact with the crew in such a different way than their captain does, and watching the crew react to
that.
how she treats them.
Yeah.
My least favorite part, this is a tricky one because I really liked part 4. But I think that things come a little too easily to her sometimes. She like kind of stumbles into the right answer a little too often for me to believe it all the time.
That's my least favorite part too.
I think my favorite part was when she's using the midnight spores and she like becomes the little rat thing. Just like, I like that part because like it's creepy, first of all, because creepy is my thing. But also it's just like makes me think like about the midnight sea when they're going to get there, and kind of like what this is going to be like. Like that was like the first hint, or like the first, not even a hint, just a blatant like, oh, this is what it's like. That kind of like set the stakes for me a bit. I'm like, oh, this is like scary stuff. Like these spores are like borderline sentient compared to like the other ones. And so like, I'm like, oh yeah, this is going to get crazy real fast once we get to like the midnight sea. So I really like that. I think if I was to have a quibble with anything in this section, it would probably be why she decides to stay on the ship. Like, I'm glad she decides to stay instead of running away after she manipulates Crow. But at this point in the story, I still feel like her main motivation was to save Charlie. So it was hard for me to like believe that she decided not to like go down the path that was probably more logical to try and find him. It wasn't like, it didn't like completely derail me from the story or anything like that. I just like, kind of like you were talking about, like things coming easy or something, like kind of, it just felt like a little convenient that she decides to not
Like you can only
leave.
trip over the right answer so many times.
Yeah. So I wouldn't have minded like a little more there to help me understand why she makes that decision, or like make it a little like more logical, because she's so logical. And she is emotional as well. It's not like she has no emotions. But yeah, so that was the one part for me that was like a little weaker than the rest of the section.
So my favorite part was when she was fixing the hole in the ship and she got to actually do her job, like use the metals and use the thing to shape it, and how high stakes and high tension that whole thing was, that she almost didn't have time. And Anne just saying, I would have had to use my carpentry skills for this and we would have died, you know. It's just like, oh, I love that scene. But yeah, same. It's the I feel like this story as a whole relies a lot on conveniences, like people being in the right place at the right time, people having the right motivations, everybody kind of just all wanting to go in the same direction for all different reasons. So all Tress has to do is make everybody believe that it was her idea. Like a lot of things that's just like, or even just learning about something and then immediately, like with the midnight spores, learning, oh, look for the stars. Okay. Oh, stars, you know, like it's just a lot of times it does rely a lot on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you know, it is a fairy tale, you know, so to some degree I'm like, okay, it's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's a piece of me that says like, okay, well, you've read enough fairy tales, this is the way they work. But then there's the other part of me that's like, okay, but this is modern and that's not what we do anymore.
There is like, to a degree, it does feel a little bit like while you're reading it, Tress is playing a video game with like the hints on. And like, you know, you went to exactly the right spot the first time. Like you didn't spend 2 hours tearing the room apart to try to figure out what was going on. Like
you had one guess.
You had one guess, and it was the right one.
No, well, it was wrong. And then Huck was like, "Oh, just look under your bed." And I was like, "Okay, it was easy." Which, he's a rat. He probably has looked under the bed, but two.
And I think like Hoyt justifies it too. Like, I think it's like directly after that scene, Hoyt's like, "You're probably wondering how I knew about this," and like so it's like justified, and they like talk about it a bit. But I would have liked more justification, I guess, to some degree, for some of like the more convenient filling like parts of the story.
I mean, it could be what you're talking about, like an embellished story. Like it may not even be exactly how it happened. You know,
he skips over the whole turn apart.
He also just maybe doesn't know, because he wasn't in the room,
or didn't think it was interesting to talk about like how difficult getting somewhere was, or like all the menial things that.
Or if he asked Tress, "Hey, how'd you find it?" she probably gave an abridged version, because that's how we tell something uninteresting, like, "I looked around the room," and so like so then that's all he has to go off of.
So it does feel a little distilled, but that's kind of intentional maybe on Hoyt's part.
Probably.
So,
Thank you for joining us for episode 2 of Brandon's Book Club. We will be back next week to discuss part 5 for Tress of the Emerald Sea. Let us know in the comments what your favorite and least favorite part of this section was as well. We'll see you next week.